All right, let's dive right into this fascinating explainer. Today, we're tracing the massive chronological evolution of the United States. And what's so incredibly unique about the journey we're taking today is how we're going to do it. We'll be tracking the nation's sweeping macro-historical shifts, from ancient indigenous civilizations all the way to becoming a modern superpower, right alongside the physical expansion of its most famous residence, the White House. We have a really solid roadmap today, breaking down this history into 6 chronological eras. We'll cover foundations in early colonization, revolution and early republic, division, war, and reconstruction, the rise of a global superpower, Cold War and civil rights, and finally, contemporary America. Okay, part 1, foundations in early colonization. Let's start with the very foundations of the continent, long before the iconic pillars of the capital were ever even thought of. So the story actually begins roughly 30,000 years ago with Paleo-Indians crossing an ice bridge called Beringia, becoming the very first inhabitants. Jumping way forward, we see Norse exploration of Vinland around 1075. But the history of the present-day United States drastically pivots with European contact. We're talking specifically about the establishment of the English settlement at Jamestown in 1607, and then the Pilgrims landing the Mayflower at Plymouth in 1620. Now we have to look at the immense duality of this early growth. On one hand, the British colonies successfully built a thriving, highly profitable agricultural system. But we absolutely must recognize that this economic success came at a devastating cost. European colonization largely decimated indigenous populations through wars and epidemics. And that southern agricultural system? It was built entirely on the systemic enslavement of millions of people brought over from Africa. Moving into part 2, Revolution and Early Republic. This is where tensions really boil over, and a new, independent republic is forged. Following the French and Indian War, the British Parliament slapped a series of strict taxes on the colonies to end their self-governance. Well, that sparked a revolution that officially kicked off at Lexington and Concord in 1775. Just a year later, the bold Declaration of Independence drops. Against all odds, the colonies won their sovereignty, leading directly to the drafting of the U.S. Constitution in 1787. Now, what's really fascinating here is how the national struggles of this young republic directly hit the executive branch. On a macro level, the nation was fighting the War of 1812. But on a micro level, that conflict literally reached the president's doorstep, when British forces actually burned the White House down in 1814. This forced a massive reconstruction effort led by architect James Hoban. It's just a crazy reminder of how the physical spaces we see today were quite literally shaped by battles for survival. Part 3, Division, War, and Reconstruction. As the young nation expanded westward, internal fractures over slavery threatened to tear the whole thing apart. By the 1860s, the election of Abraham Lincoln triggered the secession of southern states, leading to the devastating outbreak of the Civil War. It was an incredibly brutal conflict, but it brought about a monumental shift. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing 3 million enslaved people. The Union's ultimate victory, in 1865, preserved the nation and legally abolished slavery entirely. 750,000. I want you to just take a second to absorb that number. That sobering figure is the estimated soldier death toll of the Civil War. It remains the deadliest conflict in American history. It was also the world's earliest industrial war, using railroads, the telegraph, and mass-produced weapons on a scale literally never seen before. Which leads us to a pretty profound question. How exactly did a fractured republic, recovering from a devastating civil war, turn around and transform into an industrial global superpower? It's a staggering pivot, but the ashes of the Reconstruction era actually set the stage for an unprecedented explosion of industrial wealth and global influence. Part 4, Rise of a Global Superpower. Welcome to the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. Driven by millions of immigrant workers and incredibly ambitious industrial titans, the U.S. amassed massive wealth. But, at the same time, dissatisfaction with corruption fueled the progressive movement. This era pushed through massive democratic reforms that completely define our lives today, including the federal income tax, the direct election of U.S. senators, and the monumental achievement of women's suffrage. And this brilliantly illustrates our macro-micro connection once again. As the United States officially shed its foreign policy of isolationism to fight in the world wars, the presidency physically expanded its footprint to handle this new global power. In 1902, Teddy Roosevelt built the very first West Wing. Then, in 1909, President Taft expanded it further by building the first Oval Office. The building was literally growing to match the scope of the nation's new international intervention. Now, while the U.S. mobilized its industrial might to help defeat the Axis powers in World War II, we also have to impartially note this striking figure from our sources. Following Pearl Harbor, over 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent were removed from their homes and placed in internment camps. It's a stark reminder of the domestic actions taken during wartime panic. Part 5. Cold War and Civil Rights. Emerging from World War II, the nation faced an ideological standoff abroad and a fierce fight for equality right at home. The U.S. and the Soviet Union became superpower rivals, locked in a tense nuclear arms race, and the architecture of the White House reflects this terrifying new reality. FDR had already added a bomb shelter during the war, but by 1948, President Truman actually had to initiate a total structural reconstruction of the White House. He preserved the exterior walls but essentially gutted the inside to ensure the building was fortified for the atomic age. Meanwhile, institutional racism was being heavily challenged. The bravery of civil rights activists led to monumental victories, from Brown v. Board of Education to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which legally dismantled Jim Crow. This was a period of intense social reform, accompanied by the Great Society programs tackling poverty and the rise of widespread counterculture and environmental movements that fundamentally reshaped American society. Part 6. Contemporary America. Let's step into the modern era, right up into the mid-2020s. Following the end of the Cold War in '91, the U.S. became the world's sole superpower, but the trajectory stayed incredibly dynamic. The nation navigated the tragedy of September 11th, the economic shock of the Great Recession, and the massive disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet technological innovation continues to surge. In the 2020s, the Artemis program is literally aiming to establish a permanent base back on the moon. And throughout this contemporary period, the executive branch itself has seen an absolute whirlwind of diverse milestones. These range from the 1998 Clinton impeachment and a 2012 White House visit by members of the Muslim Brotherhood to the 2023 discovery of cocaine in the West Wing. We also see cultural and physical shifts, like the 2024 Transgender Day of Visibility hosted there, the addition of a neoclassical tennis pavilion in 2020, and the installation of two massive 88-foot flagpoles by President Trump in 2025. Which leads us to the very latest chapter of the White House's physical history. We're talking about a privately funded $250 million East Wing ballroom expansion spearheaded by President Trump. Designed by McCrary Architects to honor the building's classical heritage, this massive space broke ground in September 2025, drastically increasing the event capacity to handle 650 seated guests. And honestly, this quote from lead architect Jim McCrary perfectly sums it up. He points out that the White House has basically been untouched regarding major event capacity since the Truman Reconstruction. It's a great reminder that the physical infrastructure of the nation's capital has to continually adapt to serve the practical needs of a modern superpower. So what does this all mean? From ice bridges to the world wars, from a burned-down mansion to a $250 million ballroom, history isn't just a list of old dates. It is an ongoing, ever-changing structure that we are all actively living in right now. As the nation and its capital continue to expand, what historical foundations will we build upon next? Thanks for exploring this with me today, and keep questioning the history that surrounds us.